One thing is all but guaranteed in Hollywood. If somebody comes up with a great idea that makes bad bank at the box office, a flood of imitators are gonna follow suit with their own, probably inferior ripoffs. And though the history of cinema is littered with examples of movies made solely to cash in on a prior hit film, it's also fair to say that coincidences do in fact happen too. More to the point, some of those movies we've been fobbing off as knockoffs are actually innocent of all charges, as fishy as their mere existence might seem. That's certainly the case with these 10 films, which despite bearing similarities to more high-profile and successful movies released around the same time, actually didn't crib from them at all. The twin movie phenomenon is certainly a fascinating one, where similarly themed and premised films are released in close proximity to each other. But this often speaks more to the trend-chasing nature of the film industry, and how there really aren't that many truly original ideas swirling around in Hollywood. And so, regardless of their quality, these not rip-offs shouldn't actually be remembered as cynical, deliberate facsimiles of other projects. I'm Gareth, you're watching What Culture right now, and here are 10 movie rip-offs that actually weren't. Number 10, The Silence. From the moment that The Silence was first announced, many dismissed it as a knockoff of A Quiet Place, given that it similarly revolves around Earth being invaded by monstrous creatures which hunt by sound. That it was ultimately a critically panned Netflix original only furthered the feeling that it was a quiet place at home. That actually sounds like a quite peaceful movie. But just because The Silence is a bad film, that doesn't mean it's guilty of cribbing from a big screen hit. Though the film was indeed released a year after A Quiet Place, it's actually based on Tim Lebbon's book, which was released back in 2015. And before you go accusing A Quiet Place of actually being the ripper-offers, screenwriters Brian Woods and Scott Beck claimed they came up with the idea for their movie back in their college days in the early 2000s. And so, as fundamentally naff as The Silence might be, considering that the public existence of its source material predates A Quiet Place by several years, it's only guilty of being a bad film, not a lazy imitation. Number 9, Friends with Benefits. The moment that the trailer for Friends with Benefits dropped, it was impossible to separate the film from another identically premised rom-com that released 6 months prior, No Strings Attached. Friends with Benefits stars Justin Timberlake and Mila Kunis as two friends who decide to begin having casual sex with the promise that it won't become romantic. And No Strings Attached has the exact same premise, while subbing out Timberlake and Kunis for Ashton Kutcher and Natalie Portman. Tempting though it might be to call Friends with Benefits a cynical, even lazy cash-in, the less dramatic reality is that both projects were independently in development at the same time, with No Strings Attached being shot just 2 months before Friends with Benefits. After all, this isn't exactly the most ferociously unique concept for a rom-com, is it? The productions were aware of one another though, as No Strings Attached was originally entitled Friends with Benefits, before the decision was made to rename it to avoid confusion between the two projects. Ultimately, it all worked out shockingly well for both sides. Friends with Benefits was more broadly well received and grossed just $0.3 million more than No Strings Attached, with both films netting almost $150 million apiece worldwide. Not bad at all. What's your favourite rom-com of the last 20 years? Is it No Strings Attached? Is it Friends with Benefits? Is it probably something else? I don't know, let me know. Number 8, Phone Booth. Shortly after the first trailer for 2003's Colin Farrell starring thriller Phone Booth was released, film fans began to note similarities to a movie released the year prior, the Wesley Snipes and Linda Fiorentino starring thriller Liberty Stands Still. Both films revolve around the protagonist being held hostage at a single location, a phone booth and hot dog stand respectively, while on the phone with a sniper who threatens to shoot them if they refuse to cooperate. Doesn't sound fun. Though Liberty Stands Still was released over 14 months before Phone Booth was actually shot first, wrapping principal photography in December 2000, an entire 2 months before Liberty Stands Still went before cameras. As for why the low-budget 81-minute Phone Booth spent almost 2.5 years in post-production, well, throughout 2002, a series of sniper attacks in the DC area, which claimed the lives of 17 unseen people prompted Fox to delay the film's release until the perpetrators were apprehended, which they were that October. And so, after letting the dust settle and the news cycle move along, Phone Booth finally came out in the spring of 2003, where it was initially pilloried as a Liberty Stand Still knockoff, even if it ultimately fared much better critically and commercially. Number 7. Antz. It's often said that history is written by the winners, and that's most certainly the case with the fascinating saga of Antz and A Bug's Life. Of the two films, Pixar's A Bug's Life is by far the best remembered, grossing over $360 million worldwide, more than double what Antz pulled in, even though both were rapturously received by critics. While Antz actually hit cinemas 6 weeks before A Bug's Life, a common sentiment at the time was that Antz was riding A Bug's Life's coattails. After all, Pixar's film was well known in Hollywood circles long before it came out, whereas Antz only entered development after Jeffrey Katzenberg quit Pixar and formed DreamWorks, with many drawing the conclusion that he conceived Antz as a vengeful knockoff project. But even though both films center around a neurotic drone ant who attempts to save the day and win a princess' heart, tonally they are very, very different. While A Bug's Life is a broader, more crowd-pleasing comedy, Antz is a more nuanced social satire with the distinct oddball pairing of Woody Allen and Sylvester Stallone at the center. Though Pixar surely celebrated that their version of this story made considerably more money, they're both great movies. So for audiences, it's nothing but an absolute win. I bloody love both of these films and I want to watch them again now. Number 6, The Cave. The Cave was the second of 2 horror movies released in the summer of 2005 revolving around a group of cave explorers who end up preyed upon by monsters within, the other being Neil Marshall's The Descent. The Descent beat The Cave to cinemas by just 7 weeks, leading many to dismiss The Cave as a Descent ripoff, an impression unaided by the film's uniformly negative reviews compared to The Descent's critical raves. But The Cave was actually shot way before The Descent, kicking off filming more than 6 months prior. Yet once producers of The Descent learned of a competing film, they decided to fast-track their lower budget production, moving it forward from a planned November 2005 release to July instead, getting out just in front of the more expensive The Cave, which presumably required more time in post-production. Ultimately, The Descent was a storming box office hit, while The Cave barely recouped its production costs, and save for being remembered as an ersatz Descent, isn't really remembered at all. Poor Cave. If you're enjoying this list right here, then oh boy, I've got some good news for you. If you hit that subscribe button down below, you will get more of these videos in your life. Number 5, The Exorcism. The case of The Exorcism is an especially curious one, as it's the only film on this list where both the quote-unquote original movie and the accused ripoff star the same actor, Russell Crowe. The Exorcism was a supernatural horror film released this past June, but the moment its first trailer dropped, it bore enough similarities to last year's Crowe-starring romp The Pope's Exorcist that some even believed it to be a sequel. Though The Exorcism was accused of being a lazy imitation of The Pope's Exorcist, which was a solid box office success, the reality is that The Exorcism was actually shot way back in late 2019 under the title The Georgetown Project. Additional photography required to complete the project was continually delayed, in part due to the pandemic, until 2023, with post-production not being finished until this past January. Compare this to The Pope's Exorcist, which was shot in late 2022 and in cinemas by April 2023. The only thing that The Exorcism is really guilty of is blatantly renaming itself to create an association with The Pope's Exorcist, hoping that audiences would draw the natural conclusion that the two films were related. But no, a ripoff it ain't, folks. Number 4, Gordi. Let's be honest, if you stumbled across Gordi in your local rental place in the late 90s, remember those? You almost certainly laughed it off as a ripoff of another film about a talking piglet trying to avoid the slaughterhouse, the Oscar-winning Babe. And while Gordi's poor reviews, tacky marketing, and disastrous box office performance only further compound the feeling that it was a knockoff, it actually had its premiere in November 1994, an entire 9 months before Babe was released the next summer. Now, to be totally fair, Babe actually wrapped filming a few weeks before Gordi started, but given the greater technical complexity of Babe's effects-heavy production, it makes sense that it took far longer to reach the big screen. Even so, while Gordi is destined to always be remembered as the also-ran talking pig movie, it's just an unfortunate coincidence that in the mid-90s heyday of talking animal films, two pig-centric ones were made at the same time? What are the chances, eh? Number 3, Dead Man on Campus. In the case of 1998's black comedy Dead Man on Campus, the suspicion over its origins is understandable given the utterly unhinged specificity of its premise. The movie revolves around two failing college students who attempt to find a depressed roommate and drive him to killing himself, as will cause them both to automatically receive A grades. This premise is extraordinarily similar to that of The Curve, where two students plot to kill their roommate and stage it to look like a suicide, in turn getting an automatic 4.0 GPA. The Curve premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January 1998, while Dead Man on Campus didn't release until that August. But the truth of it is that Dead Man on Campus wrapped shooting 3 months before The Curve even started. And while The Curve was rushed through production to meet its Sundance premiere just 5 months later, Dead Man on Campus had a decidedly more laid-back post-production schedule. It's also entirely possible that Paramount delayed Dead Man on Campus release in order to distance itself from The Curve. Ultimately, both films were critical and commercial duds, so it was all for naught anyway. Number 2, Time Cut. Netflix's recent time travel slasher flick, Time Cut, was immediately roasted by audiences, not merely for being a bad film, but so obviously riffing on last year's near-identically premised Amazon Prime horror flick, Totally Killer. That both movies were unassumingly released on competing streaming services close to Halloween in their respective years only invited further comparison. But in actual fact, Time Cut was announced back in May 2021 and completed filming by August of that year. Totally Killer, meanwhile, wasn't even announced by Amazon and Blumhouse until May 2022, almost a full year after Time Cut wrapped. As for why Time Cut spent so long in post-production, well, it's anyone's guess really, but it's not uncommon for Netflix originals to spend numerous years on the shelf before finally being released. And in this case, it is possible they delayed it further to create some distance from Totally Killer's fast-tracked production. Though undeniably the lesser of the two similarly premised slashers, this really just comes down to time travel movies being really in at the moment. At least they focus on different decades, right? Totally Killer the 80s, Time Cut the 2000s. Yeah, that's something. Number 1, Ghoulies. And finally, we have one of the most blatant quote-unquote rip-offs in cinema history. That, in fact, is not at all. 1985's lo-fi creature feature Ghoulies was instantly dismissed as one of the many Gremlins knockoffs produced throughout the 1980s, including Critters, Spookies, Hobgoblins, and so on. But it might surprise you to learn that Ghoulies was actually an independent production that happened to be in development at the same time as Gremlins. All the same, that didn't stop Warner Brothers from suing producer Charles Band in an attempt to stop him using the similar Ghoulies title. Somewhat hilariously though, Warner Brothers lost the lawsuit. Though Gremlins wrapped shooting 5 months before Ghoulies started, Band still planned for an accelerated production schedule that would get it in cinemas ahead of Gremlins' June 1984 release. Ultimately, that didn't happen due to Band running out of funds halfway through shooting, forcing him to spend months sourcing more money, in turn allowing Gremlins to be released first. And so, while it is easy to look at Ghoulies as yet another cynical cash-in on a studio hit, that actually was not the intent, at least not at first. In an amusing everyone wins outcome though, Ghoulies made $35 million at the box office against a mere $5.5 million budget, and spawned its own 4-part franchise in the process. What a happy note to end this list on, eh? Now continue your YouTube journey with another What Culture video right here, why not?